Well, hello everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on what part of the world are you. I am Fernando López de Castilla, founding partner at GNF Worldwide, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today with my very good friends, Lourdes Ayala from Bert and Bert, Spain, and also with Graeme from Bert and Bert, UK. So we actually have been working for a long time now with Bert and Bert. And Lourdes is actually the senior partner of franchising for the Madrid office, and Graeme is a senior partner for franchising for the London office. So it's really a pleasure for me having both of them here today. As you all might know, a couple of months ago, we did the same kind of event with Lourdes, and actually with a partner from the Dubai office. So now it's the chance of Graeme from the London office. So we're very, very happy to actually be able, to bring the franchising community, the voice of such great experts around an issue that sometimes can get very complex, sometimes a little too boring if it's not handled right. But we are here, to have some fun today and to interchange some ideas. So of course, I give the floor first to you, Lourdes, and next to you, Graeme, so that you can introduce yourselves as well.
Of course. Well, thank you, Fernando. Thank you all for being here. Yes, as Fernando was saying, we have an international a great team led by Graeme from London, and comprised by a lot of lawyers around the world sitting in different jurisdictions. I am a partner from the corporate practice in Madrid, and as Fernando was saying, my focus is I have a lot of experience in franchising and doing hybrid structures, if you want, that include franchising together with M&A, an M&A layer, if you want. And we are very proud of belonging to a great group that may render great services internationally with, to franchisors and also franchisees sometimes. So, Graeme, you can introduce yourself if you want.
No, thanks, Lourdes, and also I'd like to echo Lourdes' thanks to Fernando and his team for hosting us today, and thank you all for joining us. I think one of the things that both Lourdes and I enjoy is that we are part of an international team, and we're all what I would say on the ground experts. So when businesses are saying, what's it like in terms of where should we franchise in Spain, who should we partner with, who shouldn't we partner with, can also be equally valuable. And I think for Lourdes and I and Melissa, our colleague in the Middle East, who Fernando referred to, I think that's part of the enjoyment of working with businesses and brands across the globe, where we can add some market insight as well as the legal expertise, which we're going to touch on later this afternoon. So I'm very privileged to lead this group, but we have a number of leaders in our fields across all of our markets. So it's a real pleasure as businesses continue to grow and expand, despite some of the very obvious headwinds and challenges that our clients and businesses have been facing over the last couple of years and continue to face. So looking forward to discussing two quite different markets with Fernando and Lourdes this afternoon.
Great, Graeme and Lourdes, thank you very much. And you all know what I do, what my team and I do at GNF Worldwide. Basically, we develop and expand franchises worldwide. As you know, now I am at the Madrid office, and a great old mentor of mine used to tell me that franchising could be done in two ways, right? The right way and the wrong way, right? And even though that in franchising there is not a right way and a wrong way, I do think that definitely, and in my experience, my humble experience, there is always a better way to do things, right? And the legal aspect of this is key, right? And regardless of if we are talking about a regulated market or not, I do think that, you know, as you might choose the best kind of development, you know, and brokerage help you can get, same thing happens, you know, within legal stuff, right? Because you can do all right, you know, we could be with great experts, great consultants, you know, build a Formula One vehicle, as I like to always call a professional franchise system. But then if you don't sign on the right dotted line, you know, or you don't see and watch and evaluate and discuss the dots and commas of an agreement, that could be just the beginning of the end, right? So thank you, Graeme and Lourdes, for being here. I'm gonna jump right into the questions. So first, and of course for the audience, by the way, Graeme's English is going to be much better than Lourdes and mine, of course. But that being said, I'll start. First question for you, Graeme. From a legal perspective, how do you see the franchise sector in the UK?
Very good question. We're, I would say, a mature franchise market in that you know, franchising has been a business growth model for a number of decades now, and I think franchising is becoming more and more popular for a number of commercial reasons, and it's reflected in the types of franchisees and investors that we're getting in the UK. And certainly when I was a junior lawyer, the city, as London was often referred to, didn't really understand franchising, and it was a bit of a dirty word, and it was the sort of thing that only American burger chains did. A slight oversimplification, but it wasn't necessarily positively viewed by financial institutions and financial investors. That has very much changed in the last 10 years. I think it has been recognised that it is a very effective growth model. And so we are seeing more and more corporate and strategic investment in franchising. Secondly, we have seen the growth of what we call MUMBOs. There's a terrible acronym for you all, but multi-unit, multi-business owners. So we've got, even just within food, we've got some very, very large franchisee players who are franchisees of more than one brand, not just food, but food seems to be a key area. And the third area is that franchising has always been used in the hotel sector, perhaps again dominated by the US, but hotel businesses are certainly ramping up their use of franchising as a growth model. So I would say, subject to the global pressures that we're all facing, yeah, it's a buoyant, maturing, sophisticated franchise market that we're seeing in the UK at the moment.
Right. Thank you, Graeme. I loved what you said actually about franchising being called a dirty word, you know. Of course, I mean, you know this, but maybe, you know, someone in our audience doesn't. I mean, and I hear all this all day long, right? Franchising, you know, I mean, some people have been very successful with franchising. Some people haven't been so successful, but there is like a certain shadow, right, that is always behind and above franchising. And of course, part of what you and Lourdes and I do is basically, you know, to shed some light and make this word less dirty, let's say. So thank you for that. So now a question for you, Lourdes, from a legal perspective as well, how do you see the franchise sector in Spain?
Yeah, thank you, Fernando. I think it is quite different from the UK, right? Because it's much less mature. It's legal, from a legal perspective, we've been seeing it getting sophisticated. First, we were seeing all English law agreements just translated and adapted to Spanish law. And now we are seeing more and more actual local players getting into both national and international expansion through the franchise model, and this being done like locally, in the sense that, you know, the franchise, we will, you know, we will enter into details later, but the franchise agreement in Spain has been shaped, if you want, during the years, more in practice or more from case law than otherwise, than, you know, actual law. But it's been, we have a sufficient platform, legal platform to enable the players to do the right, you know, to rely on the franchise model in Spain. Also, we have seen a lot of M&A transactions, and of course, from my experience, I see it both in the franchise, or from the franchisor side and from the franchisee side. So concentration, acquisitions of franchisors, or, you know, or concentration of franchisees network to make it, you know, more light or lighter, right? And I think the last remark that I would do is the sophistication that Graeme has mentioned. This is not only correct for franchise, but in general, the legal sector or the legal market, or better to say, the sector or the market from a legal perspective, or from our perspective, from a lawyer's perspective, more than a legal, it's becoming more and more sophisticated. So clients and in general businesses are becoming more used to use the law and the lawyers. And this has been, you know, since, you know, 20 years ago, but for the franchise sector, I would say it's 10 years ago from, you know, to now. That's becoming more and more sophisticated. And when I say sophisticated, it's professionalized. And this we can see from, you know, that in fact, the players are bigger, and they are becoming a target for private equity, which we are seeing, right? And this is a sign of professionalization, because private equity professionalize their portfolio, including franchisors or franchisees. So that's basically a view, a very brief view on the market in Spain.
Great, thank you, Lourdes. And yes, definitely. And even though, of course, there are, as you said, some differences in terms, let's say, of evolution in the franchising industry, you know, in the UK versus the Spanish industry. The truth of the matter is that, as you said as well, private equity and venture capital, you know, they are all in within the franchising space, right? And it's funny because I think that the challenge here, and that's why firms like Burton Bear or GNF Worldwide can be such help, because we actually, I mean, we live in both worlds, well, in many worlds, but also within these two worlds, right? So sometimes, for example, when I discuss strategy, for example, with people that come from franchising and just know about franchising, I mean, they disregard private equity. Like, if you are going to franchise, why would you need a private equity, right? And same happens when I talk with people within the franchising industry that don't understand franchising. They think that franchising is for poor people, basically, right? Because they think, if you have that money, why would you franchise? What would you ever franchise? But that's just because they don't understand the depths of the system, right? But when you when one is able to actually combine and use both franchising and private equity as an empowering vehicle, I think that it's strategy. Any strategy could be much potent and powerful. No, so yes, 100% agree with both of you guys. So now, Graeme, how regulated is the franchise sector in the UK?
Well, I deliberately omitted legal in my overview of the UK market. The good news is that the UK isn't regulated. I know you're going to discuss with Lourdes the level of franchise regulation in Spain, which, if you compare Spain to markets such as the US, Canada, Australia, and increasingly markets in Southeast Asia, Spain is relatively light to medium touch, which is a good thing. So the UK, the simple answer is no regulation, which really means that the franchise contract in the UK market is really important. Often my colleagues in Spain, and I include Lourdes and other colleagues, and also colleagues in Italy and France, sometimes say, why are your agreements so long, Graeme? And it's a fair challenge, but it's because in part we don't have any legislation or civil codes that regulate franchising, and therefore from the legal relationship the contract is king, and if it isn't in the contract it's going to be construed in a franchisee's favor. So I did go to a presentation a number of years ago where a UK lawyer was saying he thinks English franchise contracts will get shorter, and then the good old data protection world changed, and suddenly GDPR has become about 14 pages in its own right. And then we've had aggregators really impacting on territories and delivery. So, you know, a non-regulated market, but a real need for a sophisticated contract to fairly govern the parties' relationship. And I'll leave that there because I know we'll go into the different frameworks and what we're saying, what we're seeing. So good news is no regulation, so no big upfront disclosure, but you've got to get your contracts right.
Great, thank you very much, Graeme. Now for you, Lourdes, in the same manner, how regulated is the franchise sector in Spain?
Yeah, I think, as Graeme said, as compared to other markets, we are light to medium regulated. As you probably know, the contract itself, it's very lightly regulated in just one article, basically, which drives a lot of people crazy, because in one article it is defined. So that means the limits or the concept of what is it or not a franchise agreement is defined there, and I will give a couple of details in a second. And then second, it establishes the disclosure obligation together with a cool-off period of 20 days. So that means that before entering into any binding agreement or receiving any payment, you really have to do the disclosure as franchisor with a lot of details, and basically attaching the template of the agreement, just not to, because what you don't want to risk is that any judge says that you weren't fair and you weren't complete in the disclosure. So that's basically, a full disclosure means a lot of pages if you want to get it right, and evidence of this having been correctly delivered, because the risk is very high, because the risk is that the contract is null and void if it's considered that it's not properly disclosed fully. So that's basically the regulation, like ad hoc, like for that contract. For the rest, it's fair to say that it's applicable to some extent the UK experience, in the sense that because it's what we call, right, a typical contract, except for the definition and the disclosure obligations. For the rest, we have to rely on the contract. It's true that in Spain, under Spanish law, there's a lot of possibility. There's a civil code, right, that we can, that supplements really the contract, even if it's not a typical contract. So the fact and the truth is that our franchise agreements, basically because they're copied from the UK experience, are very long also, and it's very important to have it right also. Just a couple of things that I would like to underline about the definition of the franchise agreement, which is that it is critical that the franchisor assigns know-how, and that in this, by the way, are basically that the litigation that we see is around assignment of know-how, whether or not there was really real know-how and experience behind the franchisor. And second, technical assistance or commercial assistance, which is to be continue and very inevitable. So I think those are the two things that I would underline of the regulation. And then general regulation is of course applicable, but that is also, I guess, for the UK, right? Data protection, antitrust, etc., and consumer law, you know, other important pieces, not to forget tax, by the way. So, but that those are general, it's not general regulations.
Great, Lourdes, thank you. And yes, sometimes, you know, clients ask me if it would be easier to actually start an international expansion process targeting non-regulated markets. I mean, rather than regulated markets, right? And actually, and I think that you both illustrated this beautifully. You know, at the end of the day, like I like to say, is that the secret for walking on the water is to actually know where the stones are, right? So it doesn't matter at the end of the day how tricky the market or how complex the rules might be, as long as you know what, you know, where you know, to put your foot on, you are going to be safe, you know. But thank you for the acceleration for both of you. Now,
Fernando, I just wonder if it's just picking up on that point. Although you know, we are drawing a distinction between the regulated and either non or less regulated markets. In many respects, if you think about the US, Canada, Australia, those markets that have the very heavy disclosure requirements, I don't think it's a bad thing. You know, fundamentally it is there so that a franchisee enters into the relationship with his or her eyes open, and you know, really disclosure just gives a framework for providing information. And you could argue that most ethical franchisors will provide that information or should provide that information anyway. It's just whether they do it in a glossy document or whether they do it in a document that's required by law. So I also think regulation isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just adds time and money to a process. And I think with the helps of, you know, people like yourselves and us, it's more just saying to clients, if you want to enter into this market, just as if you wanted to get your goods into market, there are some additional hurdles that you will need to overcome, and therefore you need to budget for it and you need to plan for it. So I think, yeah, while Spain and the UK don't have those formal requirements, regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. And I'm increasingly finding with businesses, not just say a US business looking to enter the UK, but UK businesses in their own right, they will be looking to do their own form of disclosure, even though they are not compelled to do so by law. they are just ethical, and it's also done well. It's a good recruitment tool. So yeah, I think some people often misunderstand the purpose of regulation, and just wanted to make that case for the regulators, not that anyone necessarily wants to play a violin for them.
Yes, 100%, Graeme, I agree with you. Regulation, I mean, it's not a bad thing per se, you know, and at the end of the day, you could have all the regulations you want, but still, if you are talking about a bad franchise system, no regulation or no lawyer from Bertamberg is going to save you, you know. So at the end of the day, a professional franchise system and good people behind it, you know, that's the bread and butter of our industry, right? Great. Lourdes, what benefits does a regulation might offer Spain?
In addition to what Graeme said, which I completely agree, I think disclosure obligation in Spain, at least in my experience, is just a matter of, you know, a little bit more time, a little bit more planning, and a little bit more of a you know, budget. It is meant to be a fair, good faith, pre-contractual treatment of what is supposed to be the weak part, right? Or the part in which the information, more than weak, I think it's that because they do have, in fact, there is an asymmetry of information, and the franchisor is better placed to explain the risks, basically, of the business. But I agree that, you know, that there is the benefit of, in general, of security, always versus freedom, right? Which should for fair people should be the same, as Graeme said. I completely agree. One other part that I would like to underline is the new regulation on vertical restrictions that has been always named, right, lately. And this is an example of what benefits could a regulation bring, which is basically clarity on some things that are not as clear. So, for example, making sure that the franchisor may or may not apply or prevent, the specificities, like preventing the franchisee from selling in a marketplace, which, of course, that regulation, I think, has a real benefit, right? For example, or whether or not it can be, different prices can be applied to different channels to make sure that the person or the franchisee selling offline has a better price because it has more investment to do than online. Well, I think that is a good thing. So regulation, to the extent it's business oriented, in the best way we can think about business oriented, but fair with all the players, I think it has benefits. That's my view. And in Spain, I think from our perspective, the regulations in Spain applicable to franchise, I think, do have that benefit of a little bit of security.
Yes, I agree 100%, Lourdes. Thank you for that. Now, Graeme, in terms of benefits and challenges, I mean, specifically within the UK market, would you say that not having a specific regulation imposes more challenges than benefits, more benefits than challenges? How do you see that?
No, I think Lourdes made a very good point that the recent European legislation around vertical restraints block exemption has attempted to add some clarity, and I think the other point is that was a piece of legislation, or the recent legislation replaces legislation that's over 10 years old now, and it feels almost unprofessional to say what an impact the internet has had, but in terms of the law being really behind, that was an area, an obvious gap. So I think the recent attempts are welcome. I think you've also, unfortunately now for franchisors looking at growing across Europe, our political decision to Brexit, which is not the subject of today's webinar, people will be pleased to hear, means that what was almost a harmonised position, it certainly wasn't completely harmonised, is now at that point where we're going to have slightly more divergence across, between the EU and the UK. And I think whilst it was already there before, it's going to be increasingly there now. So unfortunately, that political decision, which wasn't your question, but I think it's relevant, means that there are more considerations for multi-jurisdictional franchisors looking to grow within the EU and the UK. So I think that adds complexity for franchisors. And the advantages that regulation brings around clarity and certainty, therefore, we don't have in the UK. We do have our British Franchise Association that has codes of conduct, but that only applies to franchisors that are members of the British Franchise Association. Not all businesses are. So there is that lack of homogeneity, there is that lack of certainty, but that also encourages entrepreneurialism. So there are advantages, but also, unfortunately, you will get some unethical businesses that will not disclose information or that will misrepresent information. So again, it comes really back to that first point of an ethical franchisor will most likely do its own form of pre-contractual disclosure. Okay, there will be a marketing element to that, which needs to be a caveat. But then they need to regulate their relationship really in two ways. Firstly, the contract sets up the framework, which hopefully the franchisor will really only need to use in a negative situation. The better way, and certainly I know this is what you encourage and what you advise your clients, is you don't just sign an agreement and never see each other again. A franchisor that's delivering value will be regularly auditing, regularly visiting, regularly communicating, looking to improve and update their technology systems, their various platforms. And I think you can then regulate your system through good business practice and regular touch points. That, to my mind, is the better form of regulation than a statute or what a particular clause says. So, we have advantages and disadvantages of the lack of regulation. I would still say, to your earlier comment, better business practice and that real deep relationship between franchisor and franchisee of sharing continual improvement. That's your best form of regulation.
Great. Yeah, 100% agree with you, Graeme. Now getting guys into more practical stuff. Some of the questions that we received previously from the audience, and that I have just highlighted a couple of them. One, for example, and it's actually for both of you. It says, if the language barrier is already there, I mean, of course, talking about a Spanish brands or Spanish franchise stores, if the language barrier is already there, why not considering going to the US instead of the UK, being it the market, the biggest market in the world for franchising? So the question here is, for a Spanish brand, Lourdes and Graeme, I mean, if the English language barrier will be there, why not just going directly to America and to the US, where the market is just bigger and franchising is more developed than the UK?
I think it's your turn, Graeme. I think it's your market and you can sell it.
I think that it's almost quite a narrow question in a very broad context. I often think it's interesting when we're preparing agreements for international expansion, and we say to clients, is it a prerequisite that the senior management team of your franchisee in market X has to be a good English speaker? Because that's obviously the language of the franchisor. Because I think that's not a legal issue. That's a relationship issue, and that opens up all sorts of discussions around selection of appropriate partners and what criteria there are for an appropriate partner. So that's quite a sensitive issue. I think the other bigger point, which is not just one about language, is there a cultural fit between franchisor and franchisee? And also, how does the franchisor's system, if it's a great system in Spain or if it's a great system in UK, how would it translate in the US market? And certainly, I know I've referred to this sector a number of times. The US is probably the most saturated market in the world for food concepts. So how can a Spanish food concept, how can a British food concept, and I don't want any comments from the Europeans about whether there is such a thing as British food, but how can such a concept translate into a market like the US? So I think there's a bigger issue in terms of, is there a cultural fit between franchisor and franchisee? How does the system properly translate into a market like the US? And therefore, is the US an appropriate market? And then I think issues such as language will become secondary once those key, not hurdles, but key issues have been properly thought through. And I think good franchisors will spend the right time trying to find the right partner, and then issues like language will either follow or not if the conversations are paused. So you can tell I wanted to be a politician because I haven't answered the question.
No, I completely agree, Graeme, and I would like to add that it is true that a lot of franchisors in Spain look at Latin America to expand. This is not only for franchisor or for expansion through franchise model, but also through whether organic or inorganic growth. So that is true that sometimes language may be a barrier or may facilitate, may make easier the translation that you're talking about, Graeme, because it does. The culture, for example, in Latin America and Spain is quite similar, right? But it is true that, for example, distance, it's usually, or time frames, right, are usually greater barriers than, or even regulations, right? That the fact that we do have the same consumer law across Europe, or depending on, of course, on the business. But the fact that we have the same GDPR or the same data protection, consumer law, and this type of very, very critical and important, or VAT neutral, neutrality, makes it a lot of times easier, whether to either to go to the UK, Brexit allowing, or or to other parts of Europe that where nowhere else in Europe speaks Spanish. I don't know why, but they don't. So language barrier, it's normally not that, it shouldn't be that important for a company going international, I think.
Yes.
in our experience.
Yeah, I agree with you both.
So it's not a driver that many times.
100% agree with you both. You know, language might be a barrier for sure, but when we see international transactions, you know, good transactions and even within bad transactions, much more than a language, it is the culture barrier, right? So, for example, I mean, a Spanish person could be speaking Spanish with a Mexican person, and they could be talking totally different things, right? Or you know, a person from the UK with the US, or just, you know, two people that don't speak English as a mother language speaking in English, and, you know, so message sent is not message received, you know. So just being aware of that, I think it's a very good a safeguard and a survival skill, right? So last thing, guys, because we just have 3 more minutes. So so first, for you, Graeme, how would you evaluate the internationalization process of franchisors in the UK? Why do you think that they might have been in the past more successful than Spanish franchisors? I know, of course, being, you know, because of your political skill, you're not going to answer that clearly. But I mean, just how do you see the franchising in the UK market, you know, within the next 5-10 years, and what's your vision about it?
Wow, there's a lot. There's a lot in there. I think, this is my personal opinion. I think we have learned from American systems. You know, let's not pretend other way that, you know, America was the birthplace of franchising. I think, and I'm not saying that other markets like Spain haven't learned. I just say that we were perhaps an earlier adopter than other markets. I also think there has been a greater willingness because of, I think, the UK is a relatively small market, and I think there has been a desire from, let's call them British brands, to expand overseas for, you know, many decades. I mean, if you take 2 of our most famous retail brands, which might, like other retail brands now, you know, be suffering, like we've seen, you know, Mothercare in terms of baby and children, hugely successful franchise business. It's in our public market data this week that Mothercare, who were publicly financially struggling in 2018, 2019, now back in profit due to their successful franchise model. Marks and Spencer, again, a very long established traditional retailer. It uses, to our earlier conversation, a combination of corporate expansion and franchising into certain markets. And I think what, you know, businesses like those have done, and say, you know, one of the Nordic champion franchise businesses, H&M, they have realized that to grow in certain markets, you do need that local expertise, that local know-how, all the benefits that franchising bring. And I think it's been that ability to embrace where businesses need to use local expertise versus where they can use corporate expertise, which and the ability to continue to learn and localize, which is what has driven success. And I think, you know, Lourdes will know better than me, whilst Spanish businesses may feel more comfortable maybe looking at Latin America as their first international foray, you know, is the challenge for Spanish businesses then to think, well, actually other markets would be culturally acceptable to our goods, services, ways of doing business, almost from a romantic perspective, because what the Spanish culture brings very different to what the UK culture brings. So Lourdes, where's Spain going to go?
Well, it's very difficult to say, but I would foresee that our market and our players will keep on the right track to, get more sophisticated, get more international. I think that is across all our businesses. I mean, not only with the model, with the franchise model, but across other, with different models. And I believe that we are also looking forward some more clarity, I think, in, for example, critical issues, I think, in Spain, like limits of liability for franchisors and, some things in the legal, the purely legal aspect that I don't want to enter into, but I think some things need to be still clarified by our not always uniform case law to make sure, to give a little bit more of clarity from a legal perspective on where the franchisor stands versus the franchisee. And that will encourage franchisors or brands to franchise. And so that's, I think, where we're going. And then I believe that, I think you touched on it, Fernando, before. I do think we're going to see a lot of corporate transactions around investments in the franchise or similar type of models. And we're going to see venture capital and private equity getting the advantage of the franchise model for their build-ups, whether in Spain or for the internationalization. I think we've commented this, Graeme, over the time, and this is not only true for Spain. I think this is going to be a clear trend.
Yeah, agreed.
Great. Thank you very much, guys, for your time. I think one of maybe the most relevant key point, or one of the most relevant key points, might be that for a franchisor, when designing the growth roadmap, if a market is regulated or non-regulated, that, or even what language is used in the market, I think that there are some considerations that are much bigger, much greater, strategically speaking, that do they speak my language, or is it a regulated market? At the end of the day, and you said it, Graeme, there is a fit, system-wise, culture-wise. You also mentioned it, Lourdes. So my final comment and advice to our audience now is, plan ahead, do your homework, look for good help, don't wait to get in trouble to get a good lawyer. Get a good lawyer so that you don't get into trouble, because believe me, if you pay peanuts, you will get monkeys. So be safe, good business, and see you soon. Thank you, Graeme. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you all very much. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.